All right, so the endocrine system is a series of is made up of a series of organs that are not very large in size. When you think of the huge impact that the endocrine system has on homeostasis for the body, it's surprising how small the organs really are. If you took all these endocrine organs together and weighed them, your textbook said they would come up to about 2.2 pounds. So not very large, but has huge impacts on homeostasis. So like I said, I'm not going to expect you to know all the glands and what hormones they secrete and the effects of those hormones, because we already visited that. We're going to study the more advanced concepts related to homeostasis and how the endocrine system plays a role in that. So when you look at the endocrine system, what makes it unique compared to the other major controller of homeostasis, which is the nervous system, the endocrine system, well, let's compare it to the nervous system to start off with. So the nervous system stimulates organs through what? What is the specific thing that the nervous system sends out to stimulate an organ to do its job? What did you say? Yeah, nerve impulses. We call those action potentials. So they use action potentials, and action potentials are fast. If you think about a reflex, for example, that's very quick. It's a quick pathway, sensory pathway to the integrating center, and then right back out to cause a response. So that's a much faster response compared to the endocrine system. So what does the endocrine system use to stimulate its organs? Hormones, yeah. So the endocrine system uses hormones. So let's think about the highway to get to that target organ. So the nervous system, what is the highway for those action potentials to travel along to get to that organ that it wants to stimulate? Axons, that long part of the neuron. So it travels, action potentials travel down neurons or axons. In the endocrine system, where do those hormones travel to get to their organ? Through the blood, yeah, so that it travels through the blood. So if you think about the time it takes for a hormone to be secreted by an endocrine gland and then to reach its target organ where it's going to cause an effect, it takes a little longer than it does for a nervous impulse traveling down an axon. So the endocrine system is slower acting, but hugely beneficial, because if you ate a sandwich, would you want a surge of insulin going into your blood? And then letting all that glucose out and then blood sugar crashing? No, but that happens. It happens when we have a really sugary snack without any protein. We do get blood sugar rises and falls, but not enough that we're going to crash or anything. So it's beneficial to have a slower response with the endocrine system. So think of the nervous system, specifically the autonomic nervous system, if you remember that from General A and P. Remember the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system? Those are major controllers of homeostasis, as well as the endocrine system. So the two work hand in hand. And where the two meet is at a special part of the brain that we're going to start talking about. And that is the hypothalamus. But let's talk about the different types of ways that we secrete substances in the body that are not through the nervous system. So when we talk about the endocrine system, endo means inside, and crine, C-R-I-N-E, means secrete. So we're secreting something inside the blood. So we're keeping that hormone in the blood vessels. That's what's unique about endocrine glands, is everything is secreted to the blood. So what does exocrine mean? Outside the blood. So these travel through little ducts to a specific area. So for example, the pancreas secretes digestive enzymes to the small intestine through the pancreatic duct. That is not an endocrine process. That is an exocrine process. It's outside of the blood. It's through a duct. So when we talk about the endocrine system, there are no ducts involved. It's secreted right to the blood. Remember, all the cells are surrounded by interstitial fluid, which has capillaries. So when that hormone, say it's a hormone of the pancreas secreting insulin, it secretes that hormone, and then that hormone enters, or out of the cell, then that hormone enters the blood and is whisked away to where it needs to go, which is all over the body in the case of insulin, because we need insulin to bring sugar into our cells. So the endocrine gland is ductless. It doesn't need a special channel for its hormones. It goes right to the blood and it's distributed. Where the exocrine glands do need ducts. So saliva, sweat. You've heard of the sweat glands, right? When you studied the skin. And the salivary duct. the big one in the cheek was the parietal gland, no, parotid gland, thank you, parotid gland in the cheek. So that was an example of an exocrine function, not endocrine. Some of the organs in the endocrine system have dual functions. Like I said, the pancreas. The pancreas secretes digestive enzymes via ducts, which is not an endocrine function. We call that an exocrine function. And then it also secretes insulin and glucagon to the blood. That's an endocrine function. So if it's going to the blood, endocrine. There's other cells that also secrete some hormones. We're not going to go through the specifics of that until we get into that particular system. Then we'll talk about the hormone that it secretes, so don't worry about that right now. But like I said, where the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system meet is at the hypothalamus. So we call the hypothalamus a neuroendocrine organ because it's not only detecting impulses in the nervous system, you know, information coming in and modulating information coming up sensory pathways, but it's also detecting hormone levels in the blood. So it's a control center for parts of the autonomic nervous system as well as the endocrine system. So if we look at hormones as a group of molecules, we studied a lot of them in that organic molecules quiz, right? What are some hormones that you remember from the organic molecules quiz? Let's just rattle some off. Aldosterone, epinephrine, testosterone, estrogen. Anybody else? There's a lot of people in here. Progesterone, other people. What is it? Norepinephrine. Other ones from the pancreas we just mentioned too. Insulin and glucagon was the other one. So those are examples of hormones that we talked about. Some of those you mentioned are steroid hormones. They're lipids. And some of those you mentioned are protein or amino acid-based hormones. So the way they are secreted into the blood and how they and how those glands are stimulated to make those hormones are different. So we're going to talk about that. So some are amino acid-based, some are steroids. The ones that are steroids, remember, they are lipid soluble. So they can dissolve right through the membrane. So they're nonpolar, uncharged molecules. If they're a steroid, they can dissolve right through the membrane. They do not need a carrier. If it's amino acid based, those are charged molecules. Those are water soluble. They cannot dissolve through the membrane, so they need a channel to get in. Or some type of endocytosis, exocytosis. So they need specific help getting across that membrane. So if we look at the target cells, which are cells that respond to a hormone, so an endocrine gland secretes its hormone and then it acts on a target cell to cause something to happen. For example, if we talk about testosterone, testosterone acts on the on the cells of the seminiferous tubules, stimulating spermatogenesis. Now, if those cells of the testes, of the seminiferous tubules, do not have receptors for testosterone, then they're not going to undergo spermatogenesis. So there has to be a specific receptor for that hormone in order for that cell to respond to that hormone and do what it's meant to do. So they have to have the receptors present. And there's different ways that hormones stimulate their target cells. If we look at for example, type 2 diabetes, there's receptors there for insulin, and the job is to allow glucose into the cells by binding insulin to the receptor of body cells. But what happens is in type 2 diabetes, those cells don't respond anymore. Those receptors down-regulate and are not as responsive anymore to insulin, so as a result, glucose levels are chronically high, and that's type 2 diabetes. So one of the ways, in that case, that opens up a channel, right? So if insulin binds to cells of the body, it opens up channels for glucose to enter the cell. So that's one way that a hormone can influence a target cell. Another one is it might bind to a target cell and tell that cell to make an enzyme. Another way might be to activate an enzyme. Maybe the enzyme's already made, but once that hormone binds to that target cell, it's going to activate an enzyme. Or it might increase secretion of some substance. For example, when prolactin stimulates the breast cell, the cells of the breast, the alveolar glands, it stimulates them to secrete breast milk, to make breast milk. So that's an example of increasing secretion. Or increasing mitosis. When growth hormone binds to muscle and bone, it causes those bone and muscle cells to undergo mitosis to get larger or to become more numerous during puberty, for example. Okay, so those are all examples of how hormones can affect the target cell. Just a list of 4 different mechanisms to get it to do something that maintains homeostasis. All right, so like I said, there's 2 different types of hormones. There's the amino acid-based and the lipid-based. Key things to remember in comparing the 2, and there's a nice little table later on in your notes, is how they enter the cell. So the water-soluble hormones, I want you to think of them as like going to McDonald's and going through the drive-through window. You get what you need, right? You get your bag of food. So that's like a secretory vesicle with some substance in it that you need. So as a result, you get that hormone is secreted, or enzyme or whatever, but it's held in vesicles inside the cell. So you don't actually enter the cell because amino acid-based hormones can't enter a cell, right? They can only be transported with some type of channel. So as a result, those hormones can't enter those cells, so all they can do is induce some type of secretion of something, say, from a vesicle. Where lipid-soluble hormones have receptors on the surface, so they can bind to that receptor and they enter into the cell, and then they turn on a gene, they cause mRNA to start protein synthesis to maybe make some protein, some enzyme. So lipid-soluble hormones are like an eat-in, dine-in restaurant, right? You enter into the restaurant, you sit down, and you say, I would like this, and then the chef goes in back and makes it, right? So that takes longer, wouldn't you agree? Takes longer to get food from an eat-in restaurant, sit down, than it does from a fast food. So when we talk about lipid-soluble hormones, the action of those cells takes a little longer because they have to make the protein inside the cell and turn on genes to do that. Where the protein or amino acid-based hormones are acting on cells, and what they need is stored in vesicles that are ready to go, that bag of burgers and fries from the fast food window. So much faster response when we have water-soluble hormones compared to lipid-soluble. So here's an example of a steroid hormone, a lipid-soluble hormone. Do you remember which ones are the steroids? That was 2 weeks ago. They end in, I'll give you a hint, a lot of them end in -one. Progesterone, testosterone, estrogen, aldosterone, cortisol, cortisone, same thing. Okay, so those are some of the ones. Those are all lipid soluble. When I look at them structurally, what is it that makes them a steroid hormone? Do you remember that special structure? Yeah, the 4 rings, which is what molecule is the 4-ring structure? That's also a fatty substance, cholesterol. Yeah, so those are all cholesterol-based hormones, makes them lipid-soluble. So what happens is when they want to stimulate their target cell, they bind, first of all, you can see that they pass right through the membrane. They diffuse through the membrane, and the receptor is inside the cell for that target cell. So when that steroid hormone binds to an intracellular receptor, that complex enters the nucleus, and that's where the DNA is, right? And we start this whole process of protein synthesis like we studied before, and we end up with a new protein. But again, this is like entering into the restaurant, the cell. You take your order, the waiter comes to your table, takes your order, goes into the kitchen, which is the nucleus, makes your meal, brings it back out and serves you. Okay, so that takes time. So that's an example of a lipid-soluble hormone. These hormones take time to be produced, and they have longer effects in the body as a result of that. Okay, so that's just an example. The other one is just binding to a receptor on the outside and, causing that production of that protein. So looking at how much hormone we have in the blood is controlled by a negative feedback system. So when Estrogen levels are high, the hypothalamus will detect that, and what is it going to do? What is it going to tell the ovaries to do? Increase or decrease estrogen production? Decrease it, right. If we already have enough estrogen production, we don't need more, so that will inhibit estrogen production from the ovaries. So it's a negative feedback system. Negative feedback, remember, is just, balancing. It's a balancing act. If one variable is high, if one hormone level is high, the body responds by lowering it. So levels are pretty narrow as far as what's acceptable, and if we have too much of a particular hormone, we can feel it. So, for example, if men have too much testosterone, like they've been recommending that men as they age use testosterone supplements. I had a relative that did that because he heard this on television. It seemed like a good idea. He was in his 60s, so he started taking supplemental testosterone from his friend who was a supplement distributor, and he ended up getting in fights at work. Was aggressive at home, had trouble sleeping. He felt good, a lot of energy, doing really good in the gym, but as far as that testosterone's effect on the brain and emotional health, it made him very angry, and he realized, wow, it really impacted. So that was just a small increase causing big effects. So when we're not in that narrow range, there's definitely a difference there. So when we look at what affects hormone release, again, like I said, we have to stimulate the endocrine gland, and the nervous system controls that stimulation. Like I said, the hypothalamus is the modulator of the endocrine system, and we'll talk about specific examples. So there's 3 ways an endocrine gland can be stimulated, and I'll give you some examples, and you should know these 3. So let's just talk about what these terms mean. Humoral, humor refers to blood. So there's some chemical in the blood that is stimulating an endocrine organ to change that chemical in the blood by secreting its hormone. So humoral means there's something in the blood. Neural stimuli means there's an action potential that's stimulating that endocrine gland. So some impulse coming from the nervous system is going to stimulate that endocrine gland to secrete its hormone. And another one is a hormonal stimuli, which means the endocrine gland itself has receptors on it that when another hormone binds to it, it tells that endocrine gland, okay, secrete your hormone now. So we call that a tropic hormone, the one that stimulates another endocrine gland to secrete its hormone. We'll talk more about tropic hormones in a little bit. So the first example, humoral stimulus. Calcium levels are low in the blood. That stimulates, that's detected. Those low blood calcium is detected by these little parathyroid glands. This is the endocrine organ kind of embedded in the thymus. So we have these parathyroid glands. They secrete parathyroid hormone to the blood, and that acts on bone to cause increased osteoclast activity to break down calcium from the bone and release that to the blood to raise blood calcium. So this is an example of a humoral stimulus in that the parathyroid glands are stimulated by something in the blood. And what is it in the blood again that's stimulating it? What's stimulating the parathyroid gland to secrete parathyroid hormone? Low calcium levels. Yep, low calcium levels. So that's a humoral stimulus. Neural stimulus is when the body is encountering some stress that causes the nervous system to send an action potential to the adrenal medulla, this is the gland that sits on top of the kidney. And the center portion is called the medulla. The outer portion is called the cortex. So the adrenal medulla has the cells that secrete epinephrine. And epinephrine is the short-acting hormone that responds to stressful situations. So the nervous system is what stimulates the adrenal gland to secrete epinephrine. So we call that a neural stimulus because it's an action potential through a neuron that stimulates that endocrine gland to secrete its hormone, and in the case of this, it's epinephrine is being secreted. Hormonal stimulus is the most common type of stimulus that we see of the endocrine organs. Most of the organs are stimulated by some hormone coming from the anterior pituitary through the blood and acting on that gland saying, okay, it's time to secrete more of your hormone. For example, the ovaries need more, if we need more estrogen from the ovaries because estrogen levels are falling, then the anterior pituitary secretes a hormone that binds to the ovaries to tell it to secrete more estrogen. That's an example of a hormonal stimulus. It's a hormone that tells that endocrine gland to do its job and secrete its hormone. So in this case here, let's look at these examples. The anterior pituitary secretes a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. When it binds to the thyroid gland is going to secrete its hormone, which is thyroxine. So this hormone is stimulating this gland to secrete its hormone. So we call this a hormonal stimulus. Each of these examples here is stimulated by another hormone to do its job and secrete its hormone. So in this case, it would be ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, is telling the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol, which is its hormone. This, the gonad or testes, this would be FSH or LH coming from the anterior pituitary, telling the testes to secrete testosterone. So this is similar to that first page of your worksheet that you brought today, right? You had identified the different anterior pituitary hormones and how they would impact those cells. And there's a nice picture in your book with this as well. So that's a hormonal stimulus. So let's talk some more about this target cell specificity. So we have to have a receptor for that specific hormone in order for that target cell to respond. So how that target cell responds depends on how much of the hormone is there. So for example, if a person suffers from depression and they have low levels of serotonin, that's not going to stimulate that the mood center of our brain to make us feel good and feel like things are going okay. People that have chronically low serotonin levels chronically feel depressed, anxious, low motivation, and that's because they have low blood levels of that hormone. And there's something wrong with that feedback system that they're just not able to keep those levels high enough to control mood. And that's why we have medicines, right? Some of these medicines that we use in the clinical setting is to help people that have low levels of hormone secretion and try to increase receptors or increase levels of that hormone directly because the medicine acts like the hormone. Number of receptors on a target cell. If I have a lot of receptors on a target cell, it's going to respond when there's that hormone there, right? If I don't have enough receptors, it's not going to respond. So we'll talk about how certain drugs affect the number of receptors. And then the affinity or the strength of binding between the receptor and the hormone also is going to impact the activity of that target cell. So there's this really important concept of upregulation and downregulation. So upregulation is when we have low levels of a particular hormone, the body responds by putting more receptors out there to try to increase the sensitivity of that cell to that hormone. So if we don't have enough of a hormone, we're going to upregulate, add more receptors. The opposite, downregulation, is when you have a lot of a hormone level, then the body removes some receptors because it's unnecessary to put all that energy in that cell for making those channels or exocytosing, endocytosing when there's not enough, or there's plenty of the hormone to go around. We don't need so many. So that's called downregulation. So real life example, a person uses cocaine. Cocaine acts like dopamine. It floods the brain and binds to receptors for dopamine. So there's a huge amount of dopamine available. How is the brain going to respond to that? Which type of regulation is going to happen? Down regulation. So now there's less receptors for dopamine. Now the person stops using cocaine and says, I'm going to quit. I'm just going to try to get through my day. How do they feel? Terrible, terrible. Because dopamine, I mean, these hormones we take for granted if you have stable mental health. If you don't have those hormones, you have no ambition. Just getting out of bed in the morning is a huge struggle. And for those of you that know someone or yourselves who struggle from depression, you know a little bit how that feels. But cocaine withdrawal is like times 10 because of that down regulation. So it takes time. It takes a long period of abstinence, of not using, to get the brain to come back to normal levels of secretion and receptors. Upregulation, oh no, another one of downregulation is if we have chronically high sugar levels in type 2 diabetes. What's going to happen? They're going to remove receptors for insulin. And as a result, the cells respond less to insulin, and now you've got type 2 diabetes, and you need to get extra insulin or certain medications like, I don't see them as often because we always have everybody on injection in the hospital. Starts with the M. Metformin, thank you. So some people take medicines to increase their sensitivity to insulin, but that's an example of downregulation. And then upregulation is toward the end of pregnancy. We don't quite know what triggers it, but we see an upregulation on the uterus to estrogen. And estrogen is irritable to the uterus. So what do women find toward the end of pregnancy increases? Contractions called Braxton-Hicks contractions. That's because of upregulation, because of something triggers that. We don't know what it is, but toward the end of pregnancy, maybe the expanding uterus, we don't know, triggers the upregulation of receptors for estrogen, and now all that uterus is irritable. Because in the middle of pregnancy and early pregnancy, it's quiet. Progesterone calms the uterus and prevents early contractions. So that plays a role in getting the body ready for childbirth. Okay, so how long these hormones hang around in the blood is described by the term half-life. So when they are at the peak level in the blood, that's considered their half-life, and then they slowly go down. So the half-life depends on the type of hormone and how it's carried. So if we look at how hormones are carried in the blood, steroid hormones are attached to plasma proteins. So they're carried around by plasma proteins. So they're shuttled. They have little shuttles to get them around through the body, where proteins or amino acid-based hormones are just freely dissolved in the blood. So how fast they're released and how fast they're broken down determines, what the concentration is at any one time. And the two major organs that metabolize hormones are the kidneys and the liver. So if a person has kidney disease, we would expect that some of these hormones might rise in the blood, right? Increasing their activity on those target cells. So we have to be careful with that. Same thing with liver. Liver disease, the job of the liver is to metabolize certain hormones, and if there's liver disease, that's going to increase their half-life. They're going to be in the blood longer. And the kidneys, as we age, become less active. The metabolic activity goes down, so we tend to see drugs and hormones that we give to elderly patients remain elevated in the blood longer than a younger patient. So we always have to think about that when we're going to redose a medicine, because it may not be totally cleared from their system. And the elderly are at risk of overdosing on narcotic pain meds, for example, because they can't clear that as fast as a younger person would. So we always have to use the lowest dose going into a pain control situation with an elderly person. You don't want to treat them like they're 30 years old, because that can be way too much for them. And if you think about hormones too in the elderly, if they're stressed, for example, some stressful event happens and they're upset, it's going to take a while for their body to break down that stressful hormone and release it from the body and feel relaxed again. So we really need to be patient with the elderly when something happens and causes epinephrine release, right? Something like a fall or some bad news or anything that's stressful. We have to understand that those levels are going to be a little higher in someone that's elderly or has kidney disease because of the reduced metabolism of those stress hormones. So some hormones can react instantly on those target cells. Some take a while. Some are inactive until they enter, like we talked about, especially those steroid hormones. But protein hormones can enter cells, but they just need a transporter. But anyway, the duration varies, but they don't stay out there forever. We constantly need to be producing more hormone. So here's an example of what we can expect to see when we compare lipid-soluble to water-soluble. You can see that the steroid and thyroid hormones are the lipid-soluble, and they are not stored, so they have to be made on demand. They are bound to plasma proteins. They hang out in the blood much longer, and the receptors are inside the cell. And what they do at the target cell is they activate genes telling mRNA to go in there, get DNA, and make a protein via protein synthesis, like what we did in lab the first week. That whole process is what happens when lipid-soluble hormones stimulate a target cell. They stimulate the synthesis of a protein. And that protein might be, like I said, if it's, what's an example? If it's testosterone, for example, the protein might be more muscle and bone. That happens during puberty when we see increased testosterone levels. So the protein can be any protein in the body. So again, water-soluble hormones are stored in secretory vesicles like a fast food drive-up window, and they're transported free in the plasma, easily broken down as a result of that, so they have a shorter half-life. They cannot enter cells, so the receptors of the target cell are on the plasma membrane. This is a really good study tool for this one because this summarizes a lot of the information on the previous slide. So if you can cover one half and list what's going on, then cover the other side, you're good to go. So let's talk about this relationship of the hypothalamus. We said it was a neuroendocrine organ. So what that means is that it is sampling the environment and determining when more hormone is required of one of the endocrine glands. So it has a relationship, it's connected to the pituitary gland via a stalk, which is called the infundibulum. The infundibulum, and that should have been in your drawing on that worksheet that you had. But this is the infundibulum, this double-sided stalk. Part of that infundibulum, depending on what it's connecting to, is made up of neurons, and the other part is an actual capillary system. So if we look at the posterior pituitary, so picture the person is looking to your left, looking this way. So this is the anterior pituitary, this is the posterior pituitary. If we look at this particular gland, this is not really an endocrine gland, the posterior pituitary, because look at, we have the cell body of the neurons in the hypothalamus. We know the hypothalamus is part of the brain, it's made of nervous tissue. So it makes this hormone ADH, and then that hormone travels down the axon and is stored in the axon terminals, which we call the posterior pituitary. So the actual maker of ADH is the hypothalamus, but it's stored in the posterior pituitary, and will be released to the blood when the hypothalamus sends an action potential saying, let's release that from those axon terminals. And then from there, it goes into the blood. So the posterior pituitary is a neural organ. It's made up of axons. It's not a true endocrine organ. So if you look at the prefixes here, the posterior pituitary is the part of the infundibulum. That stalk is called the neural hypophysis, which is the part of that infundibulum made up of axons. And the anterior pituitary is an actual endocrine gland. So that part of the stalk, that part of the infundibulum is called the adenohypophysis. So if I look at this part is the neural hypophysis. This is the adenohypophysis. The whole thing together with both parts is called the infundibulum. Okay, so the two hormones, again, that are produced by the hypothalamus are oxytocin and ADH. They're very similar in their chemical structure. They're made up of 9 amino acids, but their action is a little different. Now the anterior lobe is glandular. It's actually from the top of the mouth, the mucosa that forms the top of the mouth, it's like an outpocketing of that. So if we need to do surgery, if someone has a tumor on their anterior pituitary, which is not uncommon, they will actually go through the roof of the mouth to get to the anterior pituitary because that's where it's located. So if you follow the back of your tongue to the end of your hard palate and go up, that's where the anterior pituitary is located. Because you wouldn't want to go through the top of the brain, right, to get down to the anterior pituitary underneath. So very important that we can access it through the mouth. So the hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. So think of the anterior pituitary as kind of like the secretary of the hypothalamus. So the job of the anterior pituitary is to wait for direction from the hypothalamus in order to start secreting its hormones to the blood. But it is a true endocrine gland, so it makes specific hormones in that gland. So if we look at the infundibulum, that part that makes up the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, it's a true capillary network, isn't it? So this is a special connection just between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. We call this the hypophyseal portal system. And you're going to learn this semester, when you see portal, it means it's a special connection between two organs that's not in contact with the general blood supply. So a portal blood system is between two organs and not with the general blood supply. Make sense? So if someone takes a portal, like in sci-fi movies, right? Aren't they going from one location to the other, right, kind of secretively? So that's what this is a portal system where we have hormones secreted from the hypothalamus, enter the hypophyseal portal system, surround the anterior pituitary here, and tell them to secrete their hormones, and the hormones from the anterior pituitary are secreted to the blood. So this pathway here is going to the general circulation. This pathway here is going from the hypothalamus only to the anterior pituitary. So this is that portal system that is just between those two organs where they communicate. So think of the hypothalamus as like the boss, and the anterior pituitary is like a secretary that is right connected to the boss's office, right? Usually when you look at big CEOs of a company, they have a personal assistant, secretary that's right there. They communicate right there without walking through the whole office area. Same thing here. So the hypothalamus directly connects to the anterior pituitary. So if we look at the hormones from the posterior pituitary, there's those two hormones, oxytocin, ADH. Who actually makes these two hormones? What part, what structure? The hypothalamus. And then they're secreted when necessary in the body. So oxytocin is for a couple of different things. Causes contraction of the uterus during childbirth. It causes milk letdown when baby suckles at the breast. It stimulates the birth of the baby and also contributes to Braxton Hicks contractions as well at the end of pregnancy. And then ADH, another name for that is vasopressin. ADH is the antidiuretic hormone. It prevents urination. It stops urination by reabsorbing water in the kidneys. So the water goes out of the kidney back to the blood. What is that going to do to blood pressure if I bring more water into the blood vessels? Increases it, right? So if I have increased ADH, it's going to increase my blood pressure. Vasopressin is another name for it, because if you look and see other actions that it has, does it say it on here? No. Well, it increases, sorry? Oh, it increases blood pressure. So it's a powerful hormone that we give to patients that have a falling blood pressure. Like if they're crashing in a code situation, we'd want to give vasopressors. We call them pressors, medicines that increase the blood pressure. So the anterior pituitary, there are 6 hormones from the anterior pituitary. 5 of the 6 are hormones that don't have necessarily direct effects on a cell, but they tell another endocrine gland to do their job. So these top, TSH, ACTH, FSH, and LH, these 4 specifically, the middle 4, tell another hormone what to do. So we call those tropic hormones, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So TSH, ACTH, FSH, and LH are tropic hormones, or tropins, which means they're like a foreman on a building crew. They tell the workers, which are the other endocrine glands, to do their job, but they don't actually do the specific work themselves. So here's an example of how a tropic hormone would work. The hypothalamus detects that there's low levels of thyroid hormone in the blood. So the hypothalamus releases a hormone that it produces, another one. It's called TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone. That tells That goes down that special tract, that infundibulum, that portal system, the hypophyseal portal system, to the anterior pituitary and tells it to secrete TSH. TSH enters the general blood supply and binds to the thyroid gland, because this is a tropic hormone, TSH is. It binds to the thyroid gland and tells it to secrete the thyroid hormone, which is thyroxine, and that will bind to all the target cells and increase their metabolism, because thyroid hormone is in charge of increasing metabolism. So this would be a stimulatory pathway, the solid lines. Dotted lines would be as thyroid hormone circulates in the blood, that would inhibit more being secreted from the anterior pituitary and also would inhibit the hypothalamus, which would stimulate the anterior pituitary less because there's enough in the circulation. So here's some hormones from the anterior pituitary. I'm not going to expect you to memorize all their effects, but you should be able to say, or I should be able to say, that if this is lower in the blood, how does that affect this pathway? How would the hypothalamus respond? And here's an example, a real life example that might affect some, well, it'll probably affect all of you women in here eventually. And that is, as women enter into the early 50s, late 40s, they start to enter menopause or perimenopause, where the ovaries start to secrete less estrogen. And if there's less estrogen in the system, so let's just look at this pathway here. There's less estrogen in the system. So let's replace the thyroid gland with the ovaries, okay? So there's less estrogen being produced by the ovaries. So we look and see how that impacts the hypothalamus. What would the hypothalamus do if there's less estrogen? Its job is to regulate hormone secretion. There's reduced estrogen in the system. It's going to try to increase estrogen production, but it can't do it directly. The hypothalamus is boss. It's stuck up there in the brain. Its job is to work through the endocrine system to get there. So who is it going to talk to? If you look at my flow chart here, the anterior pituitary. It's going to secrete a hormone to the anterior pituitary. And not every textbook lists the hypothalamic hormones, and I don't think this particular textbook does. But there is a special hormone that the hypothalamus secretes, and it's called GnRH. It's called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And the gonadotropins are FSH and LH. So instead of TRH here, right, GnRH, if we're talking about trying to stimulate the ovaries. So GnRH is going to bind to it's going to pass through that hypophyseal portal system. It's going to bind to cells in the anterior pituitary, and it's going to bind specifically to those cells that secrete FSH and LH. And those are the two hormones that the anterior pituitary are going to release. So FSH and LH bind or enter the blood, the general circulation, and bind to the ovaries. Now, the ovaries are in menopause. Are they going to secrete more estrogen? No, they can't, because they're shutting down. They're old, they're done. The factory's shutting down. So as a result, we see this continuous cycle happening. The hypothalamus is telling the anterior pituitary, secrete your hormones, stimulate those ovaries. So if I go and look at the blood and do a blood test of a woman who says, am I in menopause? What would I look to see elevated in her blood? No. Ovaries are shutting down. Estrogens are low. Yes, yes. Specifically, FSH stimulates the ovaries. So FSH would be elevated in someone who is nearing menopause, and that's how they can determine if someone is getting close to menopause. And some enter menopause early. I had a relative that entered in her mid-30s. So it's very relative of when this process starts. But FSH is a good way to determine that level. So the body is fighting to get those ovaries to kick in, but they're not kicking in. So the anterior pituitary is the key player here. That's the true endocrine organ that's telling another organ to do its job. And that first page of your handout with the different organs on there is really kind of cementing that concept. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So again, if we look at TSH, its job is to stimulate the thyroid gland. ACTH, its job is to stimulate the adrenal cortex. FSH and LH, their jobs are to stimulate the ovaries and testes. So wouldn't you agree that these are all endocrine organs here, these first four? So these are the four tropic hormones, which means they don't act in a general way across the body. They only act on another endocrine gland telling them to secrete their hormone.